Thank you very much, Lauren. Hi, everybody. I think I know a few of you, but certainly not all of you, so welcome to the webinar. I'm very new to this, so please bear with me. As Lauren said, today we're going to be trying to find our way through the different types of landscape assessment that you're likely to come up against if you're a landscape professional, or specifying them or requesting them as a client. Just a little bit of background. I'm a chartered landscape architect. I currently run my own practice, was a sole consultant actually, but I have worked in local authority, I've worked for commercial developers, I've worked for large engineering consultancies, and when the Environmental Impact Assessment, EIA, regulations came through, the directive came through in the 1980s, I think I was probably responsible for doing one of the first environmental impact assessments. Very, very early days, we really weren't sure what we were doing, but I just enjoyed it so much. It combined an awful lot of what I loved in terms of going out in the field and thinking critically and doing research, and so I've carried on doing those for most of my life. But I don't claim to be an expert. What I must say is that the opinions that I'm giving you today are my own, but I do hope that they align with the Landscape Institutes. We're actually working quite closely together on subjects such as this, and it may end up that we can provide some further technical guidance. So your questions today are going to be helpful. Your opinions today will be taken into account, and hopefully we'll come out with something clearer at the end. I think the process is that I just talk to you for half an hour or so, and then your questions stack up, which I will then attend to at the end. What I'm going to try and do is to make sure that you understand the various acronyms that I'm going to use. I'm going to assume that you're familiar with EIA, which I've just mentioned, LVIA, which I'm using as Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment, and of course GLVIA 3. This is the current version. If you haven't got one, go out and buy it immediately and read it. It's an excellent book. It actually has most of the answers in it, and I've been using it for a long time, and even now I'm still finding clarification in there that I didn't have before. So the aim of this webinar really is to help you understand these differences between different types of landscape assessments, and also to understand what might be the most appropriate one for a given situation. I'm talking about landscape assessments, landscape character assessments, but clearly in the same framework we've got townscape, villagescape assessments, seascape assessments, environmental colour assessments. I'll just mention those in passing as we go through. So imagine that you're a landscape architect and you are being asked to advise a client about what type of landscape assessment he or she would need, or it may be that you are getting involved in a new development and the local authority may have an idea about what kind of landscape information they require, but also they may not. And part of bringing this forwards is that having worked with a number of planning officers as a consultant for local authorities, it's become clear to me that LVIA is a term which is used very widely, but then somebody says, but I'm doing a landscape appraisal or a landscape assessment or a landscape analysis, so let's try and find our way through it. Where I would like to begin is with landscape character assessment, or LCA. Landscape character assessment effectively underpins all landscape assessments. It's the starting point, and I think a lot of us miss this and go straight to GLVIA 3. You may be familiar with the publication from 2002, hope you can see that, which the Countryside Agency and others produced. That has been the Bible for a long time. However, in October 2014, that was replaced by Natural England's publication, An Approach to Landscape Character Assessment. The differences between them aren't great. It's just been updated and rethought a little bit, so clearly that's the version that you need to be looking at. I'll also just point out that Natural England publishes an approach to seascape character assessment, which may also be helpful, and I believe there may be some updating going on there. So if you're tempted to reach for GLVIA3 before you begin, that's fine, but it will send you straight back to landscape character assessment. So paragraph 5.4 says, landscape character assessment is the key tool for understanding the landscape and should be used for baseline studies. There is a well-established and widely used method for LCA, which is the one I've just shown you, which is set out in current guidance documents. These should be used to identify and describe, and then it goes on to explain the elements that you should look at. Clearly, at the beginning of a project, there may be uncertainties. You may be looking at alternative sites. You may be trying to advise a client whether a site is feasible, or what type of issues may arise before he even thinks about buying the land, let alone putting in a planning application. So here is how what a landscape architect can bring to the table can be incredibly useful. If we're going to be understanding what sort of effects can arise from new development, clearly we have to know what the baseline landscape situation is. The other important thing to realise is that what is landscape character? And landscape character comes from, there's a fantastic illustration which I haven't got to hand, but it's the what is landscape figure, and if you're not familiar with it, go and have a look, because it explains exactly all the different strands and facets that make up landscape. And what many landscape architects do is they think about landscape and green things, but they forget about the fact that landscape is made up of history, of land use, of physical factors, and also that biodiversity, natural habitats, are an integral part of the landscape, and that changes to landscape habitats, for example, through changes to watercourses, which can affect the nature of the vegetation that flows alongside them, will affect landscape character and visual amenity. So, as well as looking at landscape character, and this is clearly set out in the guidance, you need to be factoring in history, landscape history, historic landscape characterization, heritage assets. There's very good guidance set out by Historic England, which you could go and have a look at. If you feel that it isn't within your scope, then you should at least try and cross-reference your study with other studies being carried out by ecologists, conservation experts, and archaeologists. So let's assume then that we have carried out our baseline landscape character assessment, and that should let us know a lot about the landscape's value and its quality. And what it will also help us to do is to judge the landscape sensitivity. And here I'm going to move on to another type of assessment, which is called landscape sensitivity and capacity assessment. The starting point for this, again, is landscape character assessment. LSCA, as it's called, is the acronym, tends to be used before one knows a lot about the nature or the details of the development that's proposed. And there is topic paper 6, which was part of the same family of the original landscape character assessment documents, is currently it's a set of techniques and criteria for judging capacity and sensitivity. It isn't strictly guidance. And that was produced in the early days of LSCA, and since that time there have been a lot of different approaches and techniques developed. So we're hoping to take that forwards and come up with something that is a little bit more helpful. It's very, very good, don't get me wrong, use it, it's fantastic, but as it's been used, it's been clear that there needs to be a little bit more technical information to make sure that it works. I tend to see LSCA often as the stepping stone between landscape character assessment and landscape and visual impact assessment, because LSCA helps you to understand the sensitivity of landscape to a certain type of change, a particular type of change, and its capacity to absorb a particular type of change. And it's not just used for residential developments, although that's often what it is used for. It can be used in neighbourhood planning. It can also be used to understand the capacity of the landscape to accept other types of developments, such as polytunnels or solar or wind farms or biomass and other, especially intensive agriculture. So if you feel that you're being asked to tell a client what kind of landscape assessment he or she needs, then clearly you need to understand what stage of the planning or development process they're at. But let's assume that you have arrived at the point where you know what kind of development is going to be built, you know roughly its scale and its nature. So then you're likely to be in the area of landscape and visual impact assessment. It's very important to take on board that if a development requires EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, and if landscape is an issue, then you carry out a full landscape and visual impact assessment in accordance with GLVIA 3. That was really, that's the thrust of GLVIA 3, is to help people through that very technical process where what you produce must be in accordance with the EU directive and EU guidance. However, not all developments are EIA, and this is the point where a lot of us get stuck. I've been reviewing a great number of planning applications which have been coming in recently, and I've seen LVIAs, I've seen landscape appraisals, landscape assessments, landscape studies, landscape analyses, landscape reports, and most of them in their method statement say that they are following GLVIA 3, which is great because clearly whether or not it's EIA, GLVIA 3 is best practice. However, if you are not undertaking an EIA, strictly speaking, you don't have to follow GLVIA 3. It's recommended that you do simply because it's, it helps to take you through what are quite complex processes. It helps you to be transparent and objective, and obviously it's well accepted certainly in the UK in planning system and in public inquiries and appeals. So if you decide that you are going to carry out some form of landscape appraisal but you're not going to follow GLVIA 3, then you need to make it very clear why you've made this. So let's say that you have a large-scale development and your client is saying to you, what do I need to do? And perhaps you haven't yet spoken to the local planning authority. Ideally, you would be involved at the pre-application stage so that you can scope the assessment. And that is important because it's the scale of the project and the nature of the effects that are likely to arise which will determine what kind of assessment and what level of assessment you need to carry out. And this is where the issue of proportionality comes in, which is very clearly set out in GLVIA 3. In other words, if you're just looking at a small stable block in the middle of the countryside, which isn't highly visible, and the range of effects and their extent is going to be limited, then clearly you wouldn't be expected to go out and do assessment of 20 viewpoints, etc. If it's a larger scale project and it's likely to be under scrutiny, then clearly following GLVIA 3 is the way to go. The differences between an LVIA which is carried out for an EIA and an informal LVIA or landscape appraisal or landscape assessment, you can call it what you like, is set out in GLVIA 3. And if you look at table 3.1, that will show you exactly what is necessary for EIA and landscape assessment and what is not necessary for EIA. Sometimes it's recommended, sometimes it's optional. One of the key issues is significance, and again this is where a lot of us get confused. It is only if you are carrying out an LVIA for an EIA that you need to consider whether effects are significant or not. It's only under the EIA regulations that significance is an issue. In fact, what It's not in GLVIA 3, but I'm hoping that you are familiar with, and if you're not, it's worthwhile looking for them on the LI website, are statements of clarification. I've printed these out, but they're on the website. And these are where practitioners or others have started using GLVIA 3 and then required some clarification of the points. And in terms of significance, what the statement of clarification says, I think, is that, yes, it does. It says, if you are not doing EIA, and your assessment talks about whether effects are significant or not, and you conclude that they are or that they may be, it says such a judgment could trigger the requirement for a formal EIA. So I think we have to be very careful about where we use the term significance. So if you're doing an EIA, an LVIA for an EIA, you will follow the process of LVIA, which is set out in GLVIA 3, i.e. you will be understanding and judging the sensitivity of the receptor. I hope you're familiar with these terms, but if not, just chuck some questions at me and I'll clarify afterwards. You are making judgments about the magnitude of the effect or the nature of the effect that that development is likely to give rise to. And then you are combining those two to arrive at a level of significance. Clearly, if it's an EIA and it's being coordinated, that significance should be defined throughout the ES, the environmental statement, the report, so that you're all following those same criteria. So if we move away from EIA and we go down into LVIAs, informal LVIAs, landscape assessments, appraisals, clearly we've looked at proportionality, but it is far better to follow that principle through GLVIA 3, which takes you to the levels of effects. In other words, you can still arrive at a judgment that a development effects will be major adverse or minor adverse or whatever it is that you conclude, but you're not saying therefore that is significant. The other issue or the difference between EIA and LVIA actually is about mitigation. Mitigation must be considered during EIA. It doesn't have to be considered in other projects because mitigation is often to reduce significant adverse effects. However, clearly, it's effects that may be unacceptable or that may give rise to harm on landscape character or visual amenity. It's desirable to mitigate those, and so you would ideally think about mitigation and consider that in your assessment. I think that therefore once you've managed to get to the pre-app stage and you are talking to the case officer or to the client, please be aware that your planning officer may not necessarily understand the difference between LVIA, appraisal, landscape assessment, and so may ask for an LVIA when it's not strictly required, or vice versa. And so I feel that part of our roles as landscape professionals is to be able to advise both clients and local planning authorities which is the best way to go. I think also to emphasize that whichever method you choose, just make it clear in your report what you've decided to do and why. All too often, it's very easy to say we are following GLVIA 3 at the beginning and then to repeat an awful lot of what's in GLVIA 3 because it looks good. And I've seen LVIAs and landscape assessments where more than half of the document is method which I can find in any book. The second problem is that when it gets to the landscape baseline section, people don't go back to the landscape character assessment guidance and follow that process either. And therefore, this is why we get the holes in the assessments where landscape is treated as a topic in a silo and it doesn't relate to biodiversity and heritage. So again, go back to your methodology, look at the LCA guidance and follow that through. It's not just useful in landscape assessment, it's useful for all all forms of landscape practice for management. If you don't understand the language of the landscape that you're dealing with, then you can't possibly understand what the effects are likely to be. So the method, as I say, is extremely important, and if you're not GLVIA3, then explain why. I think that the other thing that I wanted to go back to a little bit was the landscape sensitivity and capacity assessment, since we've got a few minutes before the questions come up. I think I did say, but I wanted to emphasize that when we're talking about sensitivity in assessments, that landscape sensitivity isn't necessarily its inherent sensitivity, and a landscape character baseline study doesn't look for sensitivity. That is an outcome of the assessment. So that's why landscape sensitivity and capacity assessments are a useful stepping stone between character assessment and LVIA. They will often look at quite broad scales, for example, an entire village, and you may be looking around the edge. What they will do is they will identify the broad, quite wide-ranging baseline, perhaps up to 7.5, 10 kilometres away, even further if it's a wind turbine. Clearly define your study area before you start, and again, that's part of your scoping and hopefully pre-application discussions with your local planning authority. It will therefore take in baseline information such as historic landscape characterisation. It may take into account biodiversity action plans, even strategic landscape and environmental assessments. And once you've gathered that information, that then allows you to come down into more focus into your landscape and visual impact assessments. You should, if you understand the type of development that's likely to be built or that you want to assess, then that's going to enable you to begin to tease out the types of effects that may occur. So one of the things that we forget, I think, is that if we're looking at landscape character effects, that issues such as noise, traffic movement, smell, changes, clutter, paraphernalia can all affect landscape character, and that will obviously then give rise, or can potentially give rise, to adverse visual effects. So all of these things that I mentioned in looking at the figure 1, what is landscape, are important. Plus we're looking at, for example, cultural issues which aren't necessarily obvious on the ground. Was this a place where, I come from Worcestershire, where Edward Elgar composed a lot of his music, and there are places where it's known that Elgar stood and was inspired by a view to write a particular piece of music. That gives a landscape its value, so that as well needs to be factored into the assessment. So I feel as though I've probably got to the end of the different types of assessment. I wonder whether there are any questions at this stage, and that I could maybe talk a little bit more about the details of the questions as they arise. Hang on. Bear with me. Okay, so we've got a question. What do you think of historic landscape character assessment? My experience is that it doesn't tell me as much about history as I expect. Is it something we should get involved with, or do we leave it to the historic environment world, withstanding the limitations of some of their outputs? Well, that's that is absolutely a great question, because it's something that I've felt for a long time. Historic landscape characterization is a really valuable tool, but the trouble is that I don't think it's consistent throughout the UK, and I also find that a lot of local authorities simply don't have the wherewithal to either start or complete them. So if I'm doing a landscape character assessment baseline, history is is usually one of the first things that I will look at. And rather than, if there is a historic landscape characterization study, that's great, Worcestershire's got a good one. But if they don't, then I go out and do my own research. So I'll go to the library, get out some old maps. Tithe maps are really useful. I'll try and compare today's landscape with the late 19th century maps, and then we can see how patterns are changing, how land use is changing. We can often identify old routes and trackways from that, and out of that can come recommendations if a development is going ahead, that information can then be used to ensure that any proposed mitigation is appropriate, or even the design of the building and its layout are appropriate to the historic landscape. So in my opinion, yes, I think that's extremely important. Sometimes it's just not within our scope. If it isn't, I probably will still go and do a bit of background assessment anyway. But if you've got a team of people and you have got a historic landscape specialist or archaeologist or whatever, please do go and talk to them and share the information. I hope that answers that question. Okay, let's see if there are any more questions. Finding some more. Karis Swanwick has said that half the trouble is that landscape professionals won't agree on a common vocabulary. Do you think we need more, or does GLVIA 3 and the LCA guidance cover it? If only we looked. Well, I'm not sure that we'd be having this conversation now if it was that clear. LVIA is Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment. I think that's a generally accepted term. If you decide to do a Landscape and Visual Impact Appraisal, which you're perfectly entitled to do, do you still call it an LVIA, or do you call it an LVIAP? I think it would help if we did have some clarification of this. At the end of the day, I think people are free to choose to call it what they like, but as I said before, so long as you explain clearly why you've decided to do what you do and why you've decided to call it what you call it, and you clearly explain what acronyms you're using, then that's probably at the moment as far as we can go for now. Let's just see if there's any more questions here. Okay. How do we justify the need for a full LVIA to consider the impacts of development when acting on behalf of the local planning authority? We regularly receive very vague landscape statements which don't go far enough and immediately get challenged when we ask for more information. I know. So this is where we have to, I think that the Landscape Institute is going to be producing a little bit more literature on proportionality. It's really, really difficult. Clearly, if it's EIA, that's easy. It's a full LVIA in accordance with GLVIA 3. At that point, I think you simply have to professionally look at the effects yourself, because more often than not, local authorities they have to rely on the information that they're provided with, and they don't have time to go out and check for themselves. I've just assessed a landscape appraisal which said that the boundary of the area of outstanding natural beauty was 10 kilometres away. It was actually 190 metres away. That hadn't been picked up, and clearly that then sets a different tone for the level of the assessment that needs to be carried out, because an A or NB tends to be high sensitivity receptors. So I think landscape architects need not to be too polite and inform yourselves so that you are able to say to your client, whether that's a commercial developer or whoever, or local authority, this is what you need. This is what GLVIA 3 recommends. This is a large-scale study. If it's going to be under scrutiny, if we really need to understand what the effects are going to be, this is what we want. If I'm commenting on applications, I say this is what I want. down into quite a lot of detail. For example, don't forget that if you're proposing mitigation, then you need to assess that mitigation in place and understand the effects of that, because some mitigation can give rise to adverse effects on its own. So I think just understand the subject, understand the range of assessments, understand the project itself, and advise accordingly. And it may be that we come up with a brief technical note that can be sent round to local authorities that does disambiguate these terms and help people to select the right type of assessment. Okay, let's have another question. Yes, please clarify that LCA, Landscape Character Assessment, should avoid sensitivity judgments where development types are unknown. Yes, I think this is where we have to be very careful. The baseline is what it is, and from the information that you gather during a baseline assessment, you'll be perhaps looking at landscape designations. Is it an AONB, national park? Are there any international or national designations that are landscape related, including SSSIs, scheduled ancient monuments, listed buildings? If there's nothing of national or international value, is it county-wide? Is it just local? And if it's not designated, it may be valuable to local people. All of this needs to be teased out. At that point, once you have that information, then you can make judgments about sensitivity. And you're looking at the sensitivity of the landscape to a particular type of change. Okay, let's have a look at another question. Okay. Whoops, sorry, I just lost that one. Okay, I'll try to get it back. Right, if a proposal is not EIA and use of the term significant should therefore be avoided, what terminology would you use to express that there is landscape visual impact? Okay, so what you are doing is you are following GLVIA3 processes, ideally, which say, done your baseline landscape assessments, you have arrived at judgments about the sensitivity of the receptors, either landscape or visual, and hopefully you know enough about the development to be able to say what you think the magnitude of the effects is likely to be. So that what you should be doing is, or asking for or doing, is criteria, written criteria that explain how you've arrived at what terminology you're using. And normally what you'll find is that the level of effect or the degree of effect which is likely to arise is going to range from major through to moderate to neutral, adverse or beneficial. So you can say the effects are likely to be, in my opinion, major adverse, major negative, whatever terminology you use. Do set that out clearly. If it was EIA, that major adverse may be considered to be significant, but that would be set out. But that's the step that we don't take if it's not EIA. Okay, let's go on to okay. I'm surprised you didn't mention this. Presumably it's acceptable to use published landscape character assessments as a baseline for any work the landscape consultant does on landscape character. Well, again, I have personal opinion on this. Yes, of course. What I tend to do is I do cast my net very wide at the beginning of an assessment. I'll firstly look at the national character area that it lies in, all the others which are close by. That will give me an indication of the type of landscape on a national level, and that doesn't mean to say that it can be discounted, because some national character areas do have quite local features which are mentioned in them. So if they are mentioned, clearly that will increase or is likely to increase the value. A lot of counties have carried out their own county-wide landscape character assessments, which are excellent and which should be referenced. That's part of the baseline. You'll want to know what landscape character type your site is in. It may straddle several landscape character types. It may sit in one but be clearly seen against the setting of another. Some of these landscape character assessments then go down into more detail of landscape parcels, landscape units, but what they don't do is they tend not to go onto a small scale. And so what you may find is that your landscape character type is principal settled farmlands, for example, which has got certain key characteristics, and your site may be a historic parkland or an old orchard, which has nothing to do with that character type. So if you're relying simply on the published information, then you simply won't be able to understand what the landscape is that you're dealing with and what the nature of effects will be. So an orchard is a good example where it may be that they're rare, they may be priority habitat inventory habitats. If you don't know that, if you don't actually go and walk on the ground, you can't know what it is you're dealing with. You don't know what the quality or the condition, you don't know what the management regimes are that may affect landscape character and views. So in my opinion, yes, of course, that's where you start, is with the published assessments, but you just need to go and walk and smell and look and understand that landscape that is likely to be affected. It's the area of influence, really, of your site, which you need to understand. Okay. How do you think proportionality should be judged? The public sector is often guided by local pressure, and the private sector by the cost of studies. I know, this is such a huge problem. However, I think that in my experience, landscape is going up the agenda. These days, more and more planning applications coming in, more pressure for development of all types. Neighbourhood development plans, localism. People are beginning to want to know more about what landscape is and what landscape does and what it means and how they can influence and how they can have a say in their futures, the futures of their communities. And so what I'm finding is that often it's local people's views that determine not necessarily where you start, but certainly where you should go in proportionality. So let's say it's an undesignated landscape and it doesn't look as though the effects are going to be huge, and therefore a small-scale study would do. But you may discover that the field has been used by the local people for a long time and they have local events there, and therefore it's of great value to them, and so your study may need to widen its scope to have more public consultation and give people a say. I think, therefore, starting with landscape character assessment, even if it's a very brief, high-level one, where you're picking up those key receptors, designations, features, things which could be affected, ideally you'll then notice that, say, there may be 3 scheduled ancient monuments within 5 miles of your site. And normally you might think, well, 5 miles is a long way and it's a small site, so my study area really need only be a kilometre or 2. But actually your site may be right bang slap in the middle of the setting of 3 scheduled ancient monuments. So that would mean that you would normally have to go out, or somebody would have to go out and assess the effects of that into visibility. So understand the landscape, understand the nature of effects. That should then inform what kind of level of study it needs, and hopefully give you an idea of what the proportionality is. Okay, it would be great if we can avoid using significance of effect in LVIA where not EIA, just use level of effect. Exactly. I think we've covered that. I think, I don't know whether you heard a quote from the GLVIA 3 statement of clarification, which is 113 in case you're interested, which says, such a judgment, i.e. whether it's significant, could trigger the requirement for a formal EIA. So if you are suggesting that effects are likely to be significant and EIA hasn't been requested, be very careful. And again, we're talking about levels of effect. Major adverse is fine, but that's not for you to say whether that is significant or not. Okay, we've got another question. Tech Committee is working on proportionality in visualization, but there is a strong case to publish a technical note setting out what the proportional approach means for LVA in terms of extent of written content. Yes, we need to support resource-constrained planning authorities as well as consultants. Absolutely, I completely agree. But I think that we are getting better, all of us are getting better at understanding terms and understanding levels of effects and what's important, what's not important. I'm now finding that planning officers are using GLVIA3 terminology as our local residents. So I tend not to dumb down summaries. I know we have to do non-technical summaries, but sometimes people are very happy to use the technical language because it helps them to rebut or to comment or to give opinions. So this proportionality issue, I know that GLVIA3 encourages us to write and explain. It's a difficult one, and I just think it requires more thought, more discussion, more conversation. But at the end of the day, I've tried to reduce my outputs simply to hit a budget. But a lot of the studies I do are part of an evidence base, and you have to be transparent. You must, I believe, enable people to understand how you've reached the decision that you've reached, because they may not agree with it, they may not agree with your findings, but at least they can understand how you arrived at them. And in order for them to do that, there's a lot of explaining to do. So even in a small study, it may take a lot of explaining to get to how you've arrived at your decision. Okay, I think we've got time for some more questions here. You mentioned the term environmental colour assessment earlier on. Could you please say a little about what this is? Yes, environmental colour assessment. A long time ago, when I first began working on assessments, it became clear to me that whilst we were assessing effects of some type of built form, and we probably know how tall it was and how wide it was and what type of materials it would be built from, the issue of colour tended not to be raised until much, much later on. Often we were off the project or somebody else had taken it over, and the architects had just taken control and said, well, we think it should be orange or yellow, or let's have green so that it ties in with the landscape. And I'm sure that an awful lot of you will have found that the most difficult colour to integrate into the landscape is green. So I went off and started doing some research. I was very lucky to start my career with a past president of the Landscape Institute, Rodfan Griffith, and he worked closely with an artist called John Piper, who did a lot of studies on colour in the environment. And his conclusion was that if you wanted to camouflage something or lose it in the landscape, that the ideal colour to start with was black. And that's a relatively safe place to start, but it's not always ideal, because naturally what colour you select depends on context. I was so frustrated by the subjectivity of colour choice that I teamed up with colour architects in France, and we developed over the years a system called environmental colour assessment, which meant that you could actually objectively choose colours which would either be camouflaged in the landscape, or they could be integrated into the landscape, or you may have wanted something that stood out in the landscape for particular reasons. And so it's something which we are encouraging. Environmental colour assessments have been carried out and are starting to be used as planning guidance, for example. We go out, we survey the baseline colours, we use the natural colour system, NCS references, which can be brought through into RAL colours or other colours. We're trying to encourage steel makers, for example, to offer a wider range, and we can now identify colours which will suit a certain situation, and in terms of mitigating adverse effects, it's a really useful tool to have in the box, because we're living close to on the Malvern Hills, many of the issues that we have are visual, where you are looking down from a height onto the roof of a development, and so often the roofs are the last thing, or they don't even get thought about. Many of the roofs are white, they're reflective, and the adverse effects are often not even thought about or mentioned in an assessment, whereas there are ways to select the right colour to get the development to do what you want it to do. So we have had a couple of articles in previous landscape magazines. We're doing landscape assessments for our local AONB partnership, so if you want to know more about that, maybe get in touch with me separately. LCA is rarely available for urban landscapes. Yes, I know. I know that townscape assessment is a slightly different approach, and it is covered in GLVIA3 up to a point. But again, I think that once you start getting confident and really understanding the language of landscape, you can apply the principles to villagescape, townscape, seascape as well. It's not easy and the resources aren't there to do it, but I often find that if I'm in an area, I will look at other, say for example, there have been other planning applications in the area that some landscape architects will have done studies, or some towns will have done studies, so it's worth spending the time doing a bit of research and teasing out. Design and access statements sometimes aren't bad for teasing out urban character. Please, can the LI request landscape assessment is on planning application checklists? That's a really difficult one. I don't know, because I guess if it's not a statutory issue, if it's a designation issue such as AONB or SSSI, it's a good question, and maybe the Landscape Institute could come back to that one, because I don't know.
Just to answer in, sorry, this is Lauren. I know I work for the LI, but I'm the events coordinator, by no means the expert on this subject. So I will forward that question to the relevance and hopefully get an answer out to you. After this, you'll be sent a feedback form so we can get in touch that way. Okay, thanks. Back to you, Carly, sorry. Apologise for butting in.
All helpful. Okay, next question. How do you think landscape architects can reinforce the iterative design process of these assessments versus the often developer-led issuing report to tick a box? If only. And this is why I think that landscape architects need to be better at selling ourselves. And I think it's about getting people to understand the value of what we do and what we can contribute. And so many times I've been able to persuade, say, I'll go back to the example of a developer who's thinking about buying a piece of land. Now I have clients that I've had for a long time who do ring me up before they even purchase land and say, can you go out, can you have a look, do us a baseline, let us know what you think, what are the issues, what other kinds of assessments am I likely to have to do? And then, yes, in an ideal world, you go out and do your baseline assessment, and okay, development that you're being asked to assess may be so specific, it may be something like a railway or a road or a nuclear power station where what is going to be developed is going to be a given. But if it's something a little more flexible, then from your baseline assessment, ideally you would be able to say, well, a 4-story building is going to be much too much here, but single-story great, or yes if you do this, or yes if you do that, and your preliminary findings should absolutely then take the development through to a point where adverse or potential adverse effects which you've identified very, very early on, that the mitigation doesn't come at the end. The mitigation is built in. It's what we call primary mitigation, so that the whole development and the whole team are working together to ensure that at the end of the development you've got the best possible scheme. So I think we need to be better at selling ourselves, at explaining. I think if you go back and read, sit down with a glass of wine in front of the fire one evening and just read landscape character assessment from start to finish and GLVIA 3 from start to finish, they will help you to then help your clients and other stakeholders to understand what it is that's necessary and why it's important. Okay. In regards to an informal LVIA, how do you go about scoping a nighttime lighting assessment? I think that there are going to be coming up some. I've seen some publicity about assessing lighting. Again, it's something that just gets missed so often, and it is an integral part of landscape character and visual amenity, because if you're planning to build something in an area where there are dark skies, or if you're extending a settlement into the open countryside, clearly nighttime lighting is going to have an effect. And I think that if it's not scoped in specifically as an issue, as landscape architects, we should certainly raise it. I think either we flag it right at the beginning and say this could potentially be a major adverse effect or significant if we're talking about EIA, and at that point you'd have to either try and do it yourself or appoint a specialist, and hopefully there will be, again, one for Lauren, maybe further guidance on that. But it should be obvious to you. If it's going to be an issue, raise it. Do you think that tranquility and effects of lighting should be covered by the terms landscape appraisals, or are these specialist areas of study? Well, again, tranquility, I know there are tranquility maps, but no, I think that's part of landscape character assessment. It's quite difficult sometimes doing all the different strands of a landscape assessment at once, and I find that often you have to go out on different days with different hats on if your scope allows it, and just stand there with your eyes closed and is this a tranquil place? Yes, that's very much part of landscape character assessment. And how would that be affected, and what's the level of that effect? Lighting, again, I think we're looking at if it's a really important issue, yes, probably best to consult a specialist or develop that specialism yourself, but certainly cross-reference with other specialists that you're using. That's an interesting question. What has moving from working as a consultant producing appraisals to someone who looks at them for local authorities shown you about the state of professional practice, diplomatically, obviously? It's only in the last 3 years or so that I have done I'm now gamekeeper turned poacher or vice versa, and I've been working with local authorities. It's been the most eye-opening experience I've ever had. I now, from finding planning officers a little bit of an obstacle sometimes, they're now just my favourite people. On the whole, what they have to deal with, how they deal with it, never ceases to amaze me. The lack of resources that they have makes it so difficult for people working in local authorities. And I think, again, this is where now, if I'm working for a private commercial developer and I'm the one who's going in to talk to the local authority at pre-app stage, my language is very different. I'm trying to be more helpful, and clearly my client doesn't want me to open the door to a whole raft of studies that is going to increase the cost. But I think as time goes by, my clients are beginning to realise that there is an advantage in saying, okay, what's the worst case scenario? What do we think we're going to have to do? Instead of trying to avoid carrying out studies, and when the planning application goes in, being sent away to say the information that you have submitted is inadequate, go and start again. That's happened on many occasions. And if clients can understand that the waste of money of not getting it right in the first place, that it's worthwhile addressing these issues right at the beginning, then yes, try and persuade them. But be kind to planning officers. That's what I would say to those of you working in private practice. There's a bit of feedback, and I hope I can read this out. There's a bit of feedback on that last question. I'm an LA in an LPA. Had to fight tooth and nail to get landscape assessment into, oh, you got a landscape assessment onto a validation checklist. Okay, fantastic. Well, Lauren, note that one then, because I think I would have to say well done. But shout about it. Okay, we're coming back then to the issue of whether landscape appraisals can cover tranquility and effects of lighting. So I think we've covered that one. Maybe one for Lauren. Can this webinar or a summary be made available to non-specialists who have to deal with landscape planning matters in short-staffed LPAs? Yes, I know it would be better if specialists were employed. Yeah, I mean, where my interest in this began with the frustration that planning officers simply didn't know what to ask developers for in planning applications, and so it caused all sorts of problems down the line. And I think if we could work towards some sort of clarification of the terms, not just for landscape architects but for specifiers and planning officers, it would be really, really useful.
Just to mention, I don't know if everybody knows, but we are planning on uploading all of our webinars onto our YouTube channel, and a link will be sent out to everybody when that happens.
Okay. Given that the UK is becoming more fragmented and its agencies like NACRA England, yes, I know, what do you think the future holds for trying to get some consistency of terminology? No, I think it's very high. I think the more we do these webinars and the more we have your feedback and we understand what the issues are, then we can feed that back to the Landscape Institute. And yeah, clarification is important. I mean, even at the beginning, I hadn't realised that the statements of clarification were there. You know, the LI website is very good, and you can find all sorts of stuff there. So just make sure that you're up to speed, and I'm sure that the Landscape Institute will let you know how we're progressing with various new guidances and things that are coming out. So yeah, just watch the website. I'm positive. I'm positive. Okay. One example of difference is that Scotland sees seascape as coast. The Natural England sees it includes marine as well. Okay, I'm going to have to dip out of that one because I'm not. I have done a couple of seascapes, but not in the UK, and I think that's going to have to be one that needs to be taken forwards. Not an expert there, I'm afraid. Okay, just see if I've missed any questions. I'm sure I have, and if I have, I apologise. Oops. I'm sure I've missed somebody here, and I apologise if I have. I'm conscious that we've only got a couple of minutes. No, I think I've answered all the questions there.
I think you have.
So,
yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So thank you very much for listening. I really hope that was useful, that it provokes some debate. As I always say in landscape assessments, you don't have to agree, but as long as you understand, or as long as people understand why you say what you say, you can justify it and be transparent. That's the important thing. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thanks, Lauren, for organising it, and hopefully see some of you that I know soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Carly, and thank you everybody who tuned in. I hope it was informative and interesting as I found it. And as I said before, if you want any other questions answered that maybe the LI are better to answer, please do send them in. There'll be a link that's automatically sent to you saying for feedback. So just write them back to me. They come to my personal inbox, and then I can send them off to the relevant person in any department, and hopefully we can get a good answer for you. As I also mentioned, this will be uploaded onto the YouTube channel. I'm unsure of exactly when that will happen, but in the next week or so, as will all the webinars. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to Carly, and goodbye.